3 days before my wedding, my grandmother grabbed my wrist at the kitchen table, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Don't marry him until you check the safe deposit box." I laughed it off. For hours later, I was standing in a bank lobby holding a folder that would blow my entire life apart, and by the time I was done, the groom wasn't the only one who lost everything. Hey everyone, before I get into this one, if you're new here, welcome, and if you've been here before, you know the drill. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from tonight. I read every single one of them, and honestly, they make my day. Okay, let's get into it, because this story still gives me chills when I think about how close I came to walking down that aisle and ruining my own life. My name is Ruth. I'm 29 years old, and 8 months ago I was engaged to a man I'd been with for almost 4 years. I'm not going to use his real name in this video, so I'll just call him the groom, because honestly, after everything that happened, I don't think he deserves to have his name attached to anything I say ever again. We met at a mutual friend's barbecue, and it was one of those whirlwind things where everyone around us kept saying, "You two just fit." He was charming, he was funny, he worked in finance, and he made me feel like the center of the universe. My friends were jealous. My coworkers asked when they'd get an invite to the wedding before we were even engaged. Everything about our relationship looked perfect from the outside. But here's the thing about looking perfect from the outside, sometimes that's exactly the problem. Sometimes when something looks too polished, too rehearsed, too flawless, it's because someone is working very hard to keep the cracks hidden. I didn't understand that back then. I was 28 years old, drowning in wedding planning, seating charts, and cake tastings, and I genuinely believed I was the luckiest woman alive. My grandmother never liked him. From the very first dinner, she sat across the table, barely touched her food, and watched him talk about his job, his car, his plans for our future together, and she just went quiet in this way that wasn't like her at all. My grandmother is loud. She's opinionated. She tells you exactly what she thinks whether you want to hear it or not. So when she went quiet, that should have told me something. Instead, I chalked it up to her being protective, maybe a little old-fashioned, maybe just not ready to share me with someone else. Over the years, she'd drop little comments here and there. "He looks at you like he's counting something," she said once, after a family dinner. I laughed and told her she was being dramatic. Another time she said, "A man who talks about your future in numbers isn't talking about love." I didn't understand what she meant, and I didn't ask her to explain, because at the time I thought she just didn't like change. I thought she wanted things to stay the way they'd always been, just the two of us close, the way we'd been since I was a kid spending summers at her house while my parents worked. The wedding planning consumed almost a full year of my life. Venue deposits, dress fittings, family drama about the guest list, the groom's mother insisting on specific flowers that cost a small fortune. Through all of it, I kept noticing small things that I brushed under the rug because I didn't want to be that bride who found problems with everything 3 months before her big day. He'd get cagey when I asked about our joint savings account. He'd take calls in another room and come back with an explanation that didn't quite add up. He'd mention, almost too casually, that we should combine our finances properly before the wedding, meaning I should transfer money from my personal accounts into a joint one he'd already set up. I want to pause here and say something important, because I know a lot of you watching this might be in a relationship right now, might be planning a future with someone, and I want you to really hear this. When someone you love starts steering conversations toward your money, your assets, what's yours becoming ours in a way that only benefits them, that is not romance. That is not partnership. That is a red flag waving directly in your face, and the fact that it's wrapped in a nice voice and a loving tone doesn't change what it is. I didn't see it that way at the time, though. I trusted him completely. We were 3 days from the wedding when my grandmother sat me down. I remember it so clearly because I was stressed about a florist mix-up and barely had the mental space for anything else. She put her hand over mine at the kitchen table and said, "I need you to go to the bank before you marry this man. There's something in your grandfather's old deposit box you need to see, and there's something else I need you to check while you're there." I asked her what she meant, and she just said, "Trust me one more time." If I'm wrong, I'll dance at your wedding and never bring it up again. That's the thing about my grandmother. She doesn't ask for much, and she definitely doesn't ask for things like that. So even with everything else going on, even with a florist meltdown and a mother-in-law breathing down my neck about napkin colors, I drove to the bank the next morning. The safe deposit box itself held old family documents, my grandfather's war medals, some jewelry that was meant to be passed down to me. But tucked into an envelope at the bottom was something else. My grandmother had left a note explaining that after the engagement party, she'd hired someone. Not out of paranoia, she wrote, but out of a lifetime of watching people and a gut feeling she couldn't shake about the way the groom looked at our family's property listings when he thought no one was paying attention. Inside that envelope were financial records. Not fabricated, not exaggerated, real documentation showing that the groom had significant undisclosed debt, more than double what he'd ever admitted to me, and that he had, months earlier, quietly taken out a loan using documents that listed my family's vacation property as collateral. Property that wasn't his. Property that, after our wedding, would have become legally tied to both of our names through the very joint arrangement he'd been pushing me toward for weeks. I sat in that bank lobby and read through every page twice, because the first time, my brain simply refused to accept what it was seeing. This wasn't a man who'd made a few bad decisions. This was a man who had been building toward something specific, using our wedding as the final piece of a plan that would give him legal access to assets that weren't his to touch. My grandmother, in her own words in that letter, wrote that she suspected he'd chosen me not entirely because of who I was, but partly because of what our family had. I want to be honest with you about what that felt like, because I think a lot of people watching this have had a moment where the floor just disappears beneath you. I didn't cry right away. I didn't scream. I just sat there in a folding chair in a bank lobby, completely numb, doing math in my head about a wedding that was supposed to happen in 72 hours. But here's where the story turns, because I promised you revenge, and I intend to deliver it. Once the numbness wore off, something else took its place, and it wasn't sadness. It was clarity. I realized I had two options. I could confront him immediately, blow everything up in a screaming match, and let him spend the next 3 days scrambling to cover his tracks, hide assets, maybe even convince me it was all a misunderstanding. Or I could do something smarter. I could let him believe, for just a little longer, that everything was exactly as planned. I called my grandmother from the bank parking lot, and she picked up on the first ring like she'd been waiting by the phone. I told her I'd seen everything, and she just said, "Now you get to decide what kind of woman you want to be for the rest of your life." That line stuck with me. I didn't want to be the woman who found out the truth and still walked down the aisle because the invitations were already sent and the venue was non-refundable. I also didn't want to be the woman who fell apart and let him control the narrative. So I made a plan. I contacted a lawyer that same afternoon, a family friend who specialized in exactly this kind of situation, fraud involving shared property and marital assets. Within hours, I had a clear picture of my legal standing and exactly what documentation I needed to protect my family's property before it was ever at risk. The lawyer confirmed what the papers suggested. If the wedding had gone forward and the loan documents had been finalized as planned, my family could have been looking at a legal nightmare that would have taken years and enormous amounts of money to untangle, even though none of us had done anything wrong. For the next 2 days, I went through the motions. I let him think everything was normal. I smiled through the rehearsal dinner. I let his mother fuss over the seating chart. And underneath all of it, I was quietly working with my lawyer and my grandmother to build an airtight case, gathering bank statements, loan documents, and a paper trail that would leave absolutely no room for him to spin his way out of it. The morning of the wedding, I didn't go to hair and makeup at the venue like we'd planned. Instead, I asked him to meet me privately, just the two of us, in the small sitting room at the back of the venue, an hour before guests were set to arrive. He walked in looking nervous already, probably assuming I had cold feet about something trivial, maybe the flowers or the seating chart. I remember his face when I set the folder down on the table between us and slid it across. I watched every ounce of color drain from his face as he flipped through page after page. He tried the classic move first, the confused act, the I don't know what this is routine. But I'd already spoken with the lawyer, and I had a printed letter ready that laid out, in plain and precise language, that the wedding was off, that any attempt to move forward with the property loan would result in immediate legal action, and that my family's attorney would be formally notifying the loan company of fraudulent collateral documentation that same day. He tried to backpedal, tried to explain, tried to convince me it was just a temporary measure and that he'd planned to pay it off before anyone noticed. As if that made it better. As if secretly using my family's property to secure a loan I knew nothing about was somehow a minor oversight rather than the exact kind of calculated betrayal my grandmother had warned me about for years. I told him the wedding was over, effective immediately, and that guests would be informed within the hour. I watched him go through something close to panic because in his mind, in his plan, I wasn't supposed to find out until it was too late to do anything about it. He kept saying, "You're overreacting, we can still fix this," but there was nothing to fix. There was no version of we left to save. 200 guests were already on their way. Instead of letting him control that moment or slink out some back door to save face, I made the decision to walk out to the venue myself and speak to our guests directly. I didn't want rumors spreading, and I didn't want him crafting some sympathetic story where I was the unstable bride who got cold feet. I stood in front of everyone, my grandmother right beside me, and I explained, calmly and honestly, that the wedding would not be happening because of a serious breach of trust that had just come to light, and that I would not be taking questions, but that everyone was welcome to enjoy the meal that had already been paid for. There was a stunned silence, and then something I didn't expect happened. His own mother, the same woman who had spent months fighting me over flower arrangements, stood up in front of everyone and said she'd suspected something wasn't right for a while but never had proof. And she thanked me for having the courage to stop things before they went further. A few of his own family members later admitted, quietly, that they'd seen signs too, but assumed it wasn't their place to say anything. In the weeks that followed, my lawyer and I worked to make sure the fraudulent loan documentation was formally reported and my family's property was never at risk. The loan company opened their own investigation once they were notified, and from what I later heard through mutual acquaintances, he faced serious financial and legal consequences that had nothing to do with me anymore. I didn't need to seek revenge in some dramatic movie-style way. The truth itself, laid out clearly and used strategically, was more devastating to him than anything I could have staged. The real revenge, if you want to call it that, wasn't some grand gesture. It was refusing to be the person he thought I was going to be. He expected a woman too invested in the wedding, too afraid of embarrassment, too in love to walk away 3 days before the ceremony. He miscalculated because he never counted on my grandmother's instincts, and he definitely never counted on me choosing the truth over the illusion, even when the illusion was everything I thought I wanted. It's been 8 months now. I'm not going to sit here and tell you healing was instant or simple, because it wasn't. There were nights I cried over a life I thought I was going to have, over a version of myself who almost signed away her family's security because she trusted the wrong person completely. But there were also mornings I woke up incredibly grateful because I got out before it was too late, and because I had a grandmother stubborn enough to trust her gut even when everyone around her, including me, brushed her off. My grandmother still brings it up sometimes, usually with a knowing look and a small smile, and I always tell her the same thing. She didn't just save me from a bad marriage. She saved my entire family from years of legal and financial chaos, and she did it with nothing but instinct, patience, and one very well-timed piece of advice. I moved back into my own apartment, rebuilt my savings on my own terms, and started actually listening when the people who love me most try to tell me something, even when it's not what I want to hear. If there's one thing I hope you take from this story, it's that red flags rarely show up as one big dramatic moment. They show up as small, quiet inconsistencies that we explain away because we're afraid of what it means if we don't. Trust the people in your life who have nothing to gain by warning you and everything to lose by staying silent. My grandmother had nothing to gain from that warning except my safety, and that's exactly why I finally listened. Thank you so much for watching this one all the way through. If this story resonated with you, or if it reminded you of your own close call, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe if you want more stories like this one. And as always, let me know where you're watching from tonight. I'll see you in the next story.